Hello and welcome to watching The Last Word. I am Vedant Agarwal. Nearly 2 years ago, when the signs of a full-blown war first surfaced in Ukraine, India called for dialogue and an immediate end to the conflict. Ever since, India has walked what many call a diplomatic tightrope. While India has championed its long-standing strategic relationship with Russia, it has not shied away from condemning the war. As New Delhi reiterates, it's not an era of war message. It has kept its own economic interests on the top of its diplomatic agenda, emerging as a strong player in new and what many call a new geopolitical reality, and indeed also as a voice of the global south. Very rarely has it happened that India has managed to make the West concede to its nuanced diplomatic position, even at the biggest international fora. But can India really be an effective peacemaker? Can New Delhi use its diplomatic prowess to evolve a lasting peace solution? Well, on The Last Word this evening, we ask, with the Prime Minister's peace push in Ukraine after in Russia, can consensus really be chalked out? Listen in to what the Prime Minister had to say after meeting Zelenskyy.
आपने जिस गर्मजोशी से मेरा और मेरे डेलीगेशन का स्वागत किया, इसके लिए मैं हृदय से आपका आभार व्यक्त करता हूं। एक्सेलेंसी, आज का दिवस भारत और यूक्रेन के संबंधों के लिए एक बहुत ही ऐतिहासिक दिवस है, क्योंकि भारत का प्रधानमंत्री आज पहली बार यूक्रेन की धरती पर आ रहा है। यह अपने आप में एक ऐतिहासिक घटना है। कल आपका नेशनल डे है। ये बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण दिवस है और मैं कामना करता हूं शांति के लिए, सुख और समृद्धि के लिए।
All right. In fact, the latest is that a joint statement is also out. It's extremely critical. Of course, there are various important points made in that, including ensuring a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, something that both the Prime Minister as well as the External Affairs Minister reiterated after that meeting with Zelenskyy. Of course, the Prime Minister was accompanied by National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and also the External Affairs Minister. Some of the key points from the joint statement straight up. Well, one point says that the Prime Minister and President Zelenskyy reiterated the readiness for further cooperation in upholding principles of international law. Also very strong comments on oil, given the fact that the economic fallout is something that cannot be ignored. But let's listen to what President Zelenskyy has had to say. This is his first reaction coming in after that meeting with Prime Minister Modi. Listen.
Hold his economy and put him really on his place. And his place, you know where is his place. Is Ukraine. And you're a big country. You have big influence, and you can stop Putin, and you can.
All right, joining me on The Last Word this evening, Brahma Chilani, a strategic affairs expert. Also, Anil Trinogayat, a former ambassador who has served in the Indian missions in Russia. Irina Zuckerman, a geopolitical analyst and a national security attorney, is also with us. Thanks all very much for being with us. Going across to you first. Ambassador Anil, how do you see the Prime Minister's visit to Ukraine? It's definitely much beyond the photo op, because, you know, the Prime Minister has reiterated his not an era of war message. Even in the joint communique, the emphasis is on a lasting peace solution. In fact, what the joint communique also says that both the sides have agreed to following the international law in chalking out consensus. So clearly, a visit that goes well beyond photo opportunity, a visit that goes well beyond what many have called a placating move. It is a strategic and diplomatic effort, a concerted effort at that, to arriving at a peace solution.
Well, I think, Vedant, you know that from the very beginning, India has been, from the very beginning of this war, India has been emphasizing on three things: the dialogue, diplomacy, UN Charter for the peace. And that the war, later on, Prime Minister says that this is not an era of war to President Putin. This time when he was in Moscow, he went there, he told him that you can't find solutions on the battlefield. Now, everything is not in the public domain and it does not come out in the public domain, but whatever one can gather is that after Prime Minister Modi's meeting with Zelenskyy in Italy on the sidelines of the G7 summit, and discussions with various leaders there. He went to Moscow, had one-on-one meeting with Putin, which was lasted for several hours, and he discussed clearly, understood what are the red lines, how these are going to be processed further. And that's when he comes with where is the thing. Then he comes to Kyiv the second time after talking to Putin, Zelenskyy within less than 2 months. And talking here, bilaterally, of course, it has different connotations. But in the context of this war, this is one of the key efforts that India is trying to make. Because India today is also trying to project the interests of the global south, which has also suffered. And we just had the third summit. So there is a confidence, and both sides have done it. Now they have the fact that they have agreed to continue to talk, that he asked India to be represented at a much higher level at the next peace summit, that Zelenskyy has also said that Russia could join that summit. Now, that is something that both sides, which in my view are currently going through this war fatigue, are looking some kind of a way out to be able to come on the table.
Yes, and you put it rather articulately, a war fatigue, as many have called it, because, with the raging conflict in West Asia as well, many have described the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a war that the world seems to have lost interest in, but it's it continues to cause tremendous damage to human life, to property. But Irina Tsukerman, who is a geopolitical analyst, is also with us. Irina, India's position has been a nuanced one. India has not shied away from championing its long-standing ties with Russia. India has said on international fora that its relationship with Russia is a historical one. Irina, I'll come back to you. I'm being told Zelenskyy is currently speaking. Let's listen in.
During all our history, all our independent history, so it's during...
Okay. Yes, there will be a simultaneous interpretation, and our fellow colleagues, in order not to span the time for the introduction word, let's start straight away with the questions, and please do not forget to introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, President Zelenskyy. My name is Gaurav Sawant. I work for India Today and Aaj Tak in India. How would you describe your meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi? What is your roadmap for peace? And what role do you see for India in achieving that aim, especially when India speaks for the global south, for the developing countries? This war impacts all. And may I request you, sir, in case you could answer this in English for our audience?
So President Zelenskyy there interacting with the Indian media. But Irina, my question to you, India's position has been a nuanced one. India has, said this from the beginning that, we have a historical relationship with Russia. It's a strategic one. We cannot forego that relationship. But at the same time, India has not shied away from condemning the war. In fact, this is what Prime Minister Modi also told Putin, that, there's no solution in the battlefield.
Thank you very much for your question. Far from foregoing that relationship, I think India is in a wonderful position to leverage it, specifically to push peace. Had it not had that relationship, I think that claim would be much harder. How can it leverage it? By having extensive economic, energy and defense ties with Russia, but also by becoming increasingly an independent country, a global player, developing an independent defense industry, and also strengthening its defense ties with Western countries. India puts itself in a position to have that influence, to make requests, to make demands, and to use its status as a strong partner with Russia on many issues to push it to...
Irina, I'm afraid I'll have to interrupt you there. My colleague Vishnu Shom is joining us live from Kiev. Vishnu, over to you. What are the key takeaways of the joint statement that has just been put out?
Well, not just the joint statement, there's also been a press conference by President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, which I was in for the last 1 hour. If the feedback in my ear can just be stopped. But the focus of that press conference was diametrically different from what the joint statement says. The joint statement speaks about collaboration between the two countries, about protecting the territorial integrity of the nations. It speaks about 4 specific areas of advancement of ties. But I think what we heard President Zelensky say in this press conference, which I was at, was an extreme condemnation and criticism of India's oil imports from Russia. That's an issue which has come back squarely onto the table. Oil was the big focus in talks, is what Zelensky told us. There are record-breaking Indian contracts. This has an impact on the Russian economy. India is open for Russia, and that this directly helps the Russian army, and that there has to be a way to find an alternative, because India's oil imports help him very much. His society, in other words, Putin's society, will push him if their economy is not being propped up. Again, saying that it's India's oil imports and gas imports which are propping up the entire Russian economy. There is a role for India, is what Mr. Zelensky had to say, and that is to cut or to stop these oil imports, as a result of which Putin would have huge challenges. We understand what money Russia has on their oil exports to India, is what he said. Asked about whether there were any specific proposals that came out of this visit from Prime Minister Modi, or any proposals generally speaking, he said, of all the proposals, all we hear are political statements. So not necessarily speaking just about Prime Minister Modi, but generally of all the proposals, all we hear are political statements. It's not a path. We need to see specifics in a plan. So again, he was absolutely clear that, look, as far as the war continuing is concerned, this is a war that's been pushed onto Ukraine, and that there is no way that they're going to swap territories either. So there is no immediate Ukrainian peace solution either at this stage. I asked him whether the war can be sustained if Donald Trump becomes the US president, to which he said, let's wait and see what exactly happens. But the key point and the key takeaway was, we need India on our side, not balancing Russia and Ukraine. And then, he went on to say also that we are ready for, he also went on to say, we are not happy we didn't get India's support in the United Nations resolutions, but that's in the past. We look forward to a new future. But India is a very influential country. If India's attitude can be changed, and he's talking once again about oil imports from Russia, then this will have an impact on the war. He, in fact, said it in more direct terms. He said if India's attitude can change, then this war can come to an end if India ceases its oil imports. So that's what the President Zelensky actually had to say, and a very, very direct attack. And I wouldn't use the word attack, but a very, very direct series of statements as he saw the relationship with India. He did, of course, say that he would certainly welcome arms imports from India as well. And if there were any plans which were being set up, that's certainly something that can be considered.
All right, Vishnu, thanks very much for joining us with the latest there, as Vishnu is reporting a direct criticism perhaps of India's oil imports from Russia. And Irina, sorry to have interrupted you twice, but go ahead. And also looking at what Zelensky said in terms of this pointed criticism of India's oil imports from Russia.
I think that Ukraine's perspective matters in pushing any peace framework. And I think his comments should be carefully considered. But I also think that for India, these positions are pragmatic, not ideological. And I think there's a significant role for US leadership to play in resolving these disputes. First, with regard to oil, US should be looking towards building up its allies, such as the rapidly developing India, perhaps with preferential pricing for its own oil exports that could substitute for the cheaper oil that it has benefit from in terms of Russia. So US should be literally putting its money where its mouth is. If it prioritizes ending Russia's oil, it should be using both positive incentives, such as better prices for its allies, and negative incentives, such as a complete oil embargo with secondary sanctions. The second issue regarding political issues at the UN, it's worth noting that China is a growing actor with a closer growing relationship with Russia as well. And I think that sort of alliance ultimately will become a direct threat to India's own interests and should be carefully considered.
Right, and we also saw, perhaps China's jibe at the Prime Minister's visit to Ukraine as well. But Brahma Chalani, just looking at India's diplomatic message, the diplomatic stance that India has taken since the beginning of the war, do you think the fact that India continues to import oil, India continues to sort of champion its strategic relationship with Russia, is it in a sense contradictory to its larger diplomatic message of peace and of a lasting solution away from the battlefield? Or do you think that this is a diplomatic stance and a diplomatic position that the West and indeed the entire world has been able to reckon with?
There are several things to what you asked. First, there are no US or Western sanctions to importing oil from Russia. There are US sanctions on Iranian oil exports, and India has fully complied with US sanctions, leaving Iranian oil almost exclusively for China. The most discounted oil on the world markets today is the oil from Iran, which India is not buying because of US sanctions. India is buying Russian oil because the Americans have applied no sanctions on Russian oil exports. Second, which is even more important because I find Zelensky's strident criticism of India hypocritical, because more than India, it is Europe that is contributing to Russia's coffers by increasing gas imports from Russia. Just in the month of May this year, Russian gas exports to Europe overtook American gas exports to Europe. Compared with what Europe is paying Russia, India's payments to Russia for oil are much lower.
Yes.
So if Zelensky believes that India's oil imports are contributing to Russia's war machine, he should be first asking his own allies in Europe to stop importing Russian gas. But I think both his strident criticism of India in his press conference, as well as the statements of Ukrainian officials who have said publicly in recent days, especially in the last 48 hours, that they do not see a mediating role for India. They do not see a mediating role for India. That leaves the question as to what Modi has sought to accomplish by going to Kyiv at this juncture.
Yes.
At this juncture, both Russia and Ukraine are not interested in ceasefire negotiations. Russia says that as long as the Ukrainian incursion into Russian territory does not end, as long as there are Ukrainian soldiers on Russian territory, there will be no talks of any kind with Ukraine.
So you made an important point there, that India has been compliant. India has always upheld the international law and the international charter, the UN charter.
I'm sorry. You know, those are unilateral sanctions by the US on Iran. They have no sanctity of international law.
Yes.
But India has been compliant with those unilateral sanctions. But because there are no American sanctions on Russian oil exports, so India is importing oil from Russia. That's the point I made.
Yes. And Ambassador Anil, would you agree with that? Because, you know, looking at India's larger role as a peacemaker, you know, what India managed to achieve, say, in the New Delhi Declaration, you know, what many call an insurmountable challenge was getting the West and Russia to sort of agree on the Ukraine language. Many say it was a watered down sort of declaration, but the fact that there was consensus, there was larger consensus, does sort of beg the question that India in a favorable position to be the perfect peacemaker, you know, amid this raging conflict?
Well, firstly, I would say that I fully agree with Mr. Chalani as far as this hypocrisy on oil imports or gas imports are concerned, or filling the Russian coffers, whatever it is. On the other hand, you know, I always believe, and this is perhaps because I've been a diplomat, that there is no wrong time for looking for peace. You have to always keep on trying. As far as India's credibility is concerned, it's the fact that India currently is the only leader, Prime Minister Modi, who can talk to both the people and find some solutions if possible. So you are not saying that this is the solution. Of course, as you know, in the joint statement the Ukrainians have said that the peace formula or the communique that was agreed and the Switzerland summit would be the one which is the starting point for discussion. So obviously at some place, at certain position, but today as we are talking in this moment, because the war is escalated because of the Kursk invasion by the Ukrainians, I believe that the Russia is going to retaliate, and both would like to end it, thinking that they are getting into this war of one-upmanship. So that is why, at the moment, it looks unlikely, but one has to continue to make efforts. This is the effort that India has made at the highest level. Now the discussion will continue. Both sides have agreed that we'll continue to work on it. Now there is much more, but I fully agree with everyone here that the doors to this peace, if at all it happens, eventually will lie in Washington, D.C. That is very important to understand that. Secondly, I would say that Prime Minister Modi has been requested by everybody, including Zelenskyy himself, to go and talk to Putin. Even today, they have been talking about like that. So
that's an important
what else do you expect? A country which is now also trying to be the voice of the global south and look at the thing. This is what precisely has been mentioned. So what we are trying to do is in the cause of peace. We are not the mediators. We are simply an interlocutor in that sense of the term, and creating a goodwill if possible and find certain kind of common discussion points, if at all possible. And if necessary, India would be ready to host it in Delhi itself.
That's a very important point you're making, that we're not to describe a role as a mediator, perhaps not be as accurate as an interlocutor for peace. And as you said, there's no wrong time for peace, just as there's no right time for war. And Irina, what could be a possible peace solution in the region? Many have talked about this proposal of a swap of territory, given of course the recent incursions. But what could be the probable peace solution in the region?
Quite frankly, I think the best solution for this war is to have overwhelming and unified international pressure on Russia to withdraw, because it has violated multiple international laws in invading Ukraine, and everybody knows that. And I think India can actually play a very effective role in being a part of that front, but I think India needs to get something practical out of that role, and I think Ukraine can play a part in strengthening its own relationship and giving India an incentive to play that part. I think there are economic incentives that need to be considered because Russia has been an important ally for Ukraine. And I think there are also other incentives, such as inviting India as an investor in Ukraine rather than bringing China in for post-reconstruction talks. I think all of these security and economic considerations would heavily influence India's direction on being part of the solution and how it is a part of that solution. I think we can see from Russia's position outside Ukraine, all over Europe and several other countries, that it is looking to extend its military and political influence in ways that are decidedly unwelcome by sovereign countries. And I think this is something India could be concerned about, as well as it strengthens its relations with the West against China. And I think it has an important role to play as part of its being part of a solution to confronting and resolving that issue, but it needs incentives.
And Brahmacharani, come in on this. How would you look at India's diplomatic strategy, say in the past 2 years, vis-a-vis the Ukraine conflict and also the conflict in West Asia? India has often said that it has moved away from non-alignment to what many call multi-alignment. And it's something that we've talked about in international fora as well. So is it neutrality? Is it non-alignment? Is it multi-alignment? As Jaishankar has said often, that we are not neutral, but we're on the side of peace.
Well, first, India's position is very similar to the position of other non-Western democracies. In fact, all important non-Western democracies have stayed neutral in the Ukraine conflict. But also, one other thing which stands out about Modi's visit is that many Western leaders have visited Ukraine since 2022, but Modi's trip is the highest profile visit of a non-Western leader to Ukraine. That's why it's attracting so much attention internationally. In fact, there are just a few countries that can play the role of a mediator or go-between in the Ukraine conflict. India is the most prominent of such countries. India played a very important role, for example, decades ago in the Korean War, in the ceasefire negotiations that led to a formal armistice agreement. In that war, in the Korean War, the war reached a stalemate in July 1951.
Right.
But it took 2 years of efforts before a ceasefire agreement could be reached. Now, in the Ukraine war, there's already a stalemate.
Right.
The question is, when will the warring parties be ready to accept a ceasefire? Because a ceasefire cannot be achieved overnight. It'll involve tough and lengthy negotiations.
Yes.
Right now, the road to peace, the road to a ceasefire in Ukraine lies through Washington,
yes.
and the Biden administration has no interest whatsoever
yes, and that's
in
something
ceasefire
that
talks.
The panel, in fact, has reiterated. In fact, I just have enough time for closing comments. Ambassador Anil, to you first. India has also kept its own interest on the top of the diplomatic agenda to make sure that there are no supply chain disruptions, to make sure that the economic fallout is not as grave for India. So, of course, that is also a crucial part of Modi's diplomacy.
Well, this is obviously, any foreign policy essentially aims to serve its own national interest. And India is doing what anybody else would do. And we have to find alternates for our dependencies on oil and gas on other countries is so tremendous. And therefore, we need to find better ways to stabilize our own economy and the country itself. So that's what precisely we have done. And thereafter, India also looks at the world in a form we like to do better things for the rest of the world if we can. And that's why the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and there's so many other examples are there in action which are seen and acknowledged by the rest of the world.
Right. The last word to you, Irana. There is no simple answer to this, and there is no one sort of answer to this. But how do we usher in an era of peace, given the fact that, there's no right time for war, and the cost of war is absolutely unimaginable? How do we usher in an era of peace?
I think India has an immediate role to play in that regard, and one of the ways it could play towards peace is by using its leadership position as a leader of the global South countries in many respects to build up positive economic and security relationships with Ukraine. Even if the bilateral issues with Russia cannot be solved speedily overnight, just this positive dynamic, I think, contributes towards peace, contributes towards problem solving of economic impact of this war, which is a top priority for these countries. And I think that will contribute to a long-term solution. Because when there is this sort of practical benefit, when there's a positive relationship, and when there is a building of bridges, I think these countries...
In fact, as the Prime Minister himself said, that there is no solution to anything in the battlefield, and I think that's a larger message. Thanks very much all for being with us on The Last Word this evening, a story that we will continue to track very, very closely. Can there be consensus? That is the big question. That's all the time that we have on The Last Word this evening. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.